This is Aaron Edwards, Santos Springs, March 6, 2026. Welcome to this week's edition of the Friday Field Report South America. An awful lot of safrinha corn got planted last week. No spoilers. We're going to talk about their planting progress. We're going to look at a little weather forecast of what they expect rain-wise, and then we're going to wrap up talking about farmers selling in Brazil, how much pressure we can expect from farmers selling beans down there as harvest progresses, and also the impact that their exchange rate has on that. So those are the major topics we want to go over. We're going to start looking at field progress with the corn, and then weather, and then we'll wrap up with soybeans. So hold on tight. Let's get at it. All right. So as we look at the reports, the first thing we want to do, let me grab a marker here. We just want to see big picture. Move that out of the way. This is their double crop corn. Depending on yields and acreage year to year, 75 to 80% of Brazil's total corn production is double crop after soybeans. Last week, as a nation, they were 46.7% planted. I shouldn't say last week. I should say the week of the 21st. As of the last 2 weeks, they were behind on the 21st of February, and then they planted 20%, well, almost 18% of the crop was planted, and they actually did a leapfrog, and they're actually ahead. If you look at historic 5-year average, they're actually ahead of that 57.2%. So the report that came out this week that let us know how much was planted as of the last week of February was a surprise. They got an awful lot of safrinha corn planted. There's a couple of states. Well, let's just look in general, and then we'll go top to bottom. But you can just look at the progress here in terms of percentage. Paraná, 15% of the crop was planted last week. Mato Grosso, 15% of the crop was planted last week. Mato Grosso do Sul, they went from 20 to 45. That's 26% of the crop was planted last year. Then let's look at last week. Maranhão, 30% of the crop was planted last week. Then here we have 11%, 10%. 3%, but that, if you remember, this was one of those states that was having 3 to 6 inches of rain last week. So the fact that they got 3% is impressive. And then another really big planting state, 33% of the crop, a third of the acres was planted last week. And very big surprise, they leapfrogged the historic average. Just an awful lot of corn, safrinha corn, went in last week. So now, as we look at weather forecasts, until last week, excessive rains, if anything, was bullish. But now that it's in the ground, it's kind of a mixed story. Now, there is something that is important to point out is we're not. I'll get this back up here. So similar to historic averages, but only 65% of the crop is planted. So it is very important to finish planting, to not have an acreage adjustment. Next week we have the USDA report on Tuesday. Then we have the Brazilian government agency, the CONAB. They're going to put out their report on Thursday. We could see an adjustment to acreage or yields from either one of those on Brazil's safrinha corn. Usually, historically, CONAB is a little bit quicker to make adjustments than the USDA. And based on these reports, we'll see what comes out next Monday. But they're no longer behind, so we might not see an adjustment. But that's just something to know. Back over to weather. Excessive rains was bullish to some extent because you have to get planted. Well, now that it's planted, if anything, it turns bearish. And there is just, if you look at the 7-day forecast, north to south, anywhere from, what would we say, most regions, it's 1.5 or 2 inches, all the way up to about 3 inches. So 1 to 3 inches north to south across Brazil, Paraguay, most of Argentina. I didn't show we could see northern Argentina here. I didn't show the rest of Argentina, but there's just widespread rain. So it's tough. It's tough to paint a bullish story from the standpoint of the corn with that rainfall, except for the fact that they still need to plant a third of the crop, so it could be bullish. And then on the soybeans, they still need to harvest. We're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about soybeans. So is next week's weather bullish or bearish? Well, on 60, 2/3 of the corn, it's bullish, it's good, it's friendly, it's helping it. On the beans that need to be harvested, it's probably neutral, maybe bearish. Maybe bullish if it messes up harvest, but it's probably neutral because some beans still need to develop. So it's one of those times where the rain is good and bad all at the same. I don't necessarily know that it gives us a picture. If corn planting had stayed delayed, if we were still at 45, 50, if we were still very delayed on siphoning of corn, if more than half the crop needed to be planted and we had this much rain, yeah, I think it would be pretty bullish. But now let's shift gears to soybeans. And I want to be able to mark this up here. Let's get a highlighter because I think that'll serve us the best. Well, we'll just use the black marker for now in case I want to write something. So these are all rounded numbers. If you look at actual harvest is slightly over 40%. The historic, so soybean, what percentage of the soybeans have been harvested? 40%. Historically, as of this week, we'd be at about 38%. So it's a little bit faster than the historic average. But here's what I wanted to point out. So there's a lot of forward pricing. Estimates vary. But if we just say that as a whole, let's just say that Brazil was 40% forward priced coming into harvest. And it might even be higher than that, but let's just say it was 40%. So what we know is the estimates from, I'm going to use rounded numbers, but they're based on numbers from institutions. So let's go here. So CONAB says that Brazil is 40% harvested, ballpark, a little bit more than that. And as of the end of January, farmers in Mato Grosso, according to their state institution, had priced half of the crop. Now we know that part of that is forward pricing. So how much actual selling pressure have we experienced from harvest? Well, it would be whatever was forward priced minus whatever was sold over the scales, right? Which is not very much. I would say at maximum, we're talking maybe 10% has been priced of the crop so far that isn't just filling contracts. What I'm trying to say is most of the pricing that we have experienced, most of that 50% pricing, most of the grain in Brazil that is priced has not been pricing over the scales. Most of it is just filling contracts. So 40% is harvested, and the lion's share of that is just filling contracts. They're hauling in to meet obligations that they had on forward contracts. That's the main thing that we're seeing so far. Only about 15%, some estimates would have that closer to 20, but I actually think it's under 15, especially with good yields. If you look at the expansion area, only about 15 can be stored on farm. So let's just do some quick math. 50% is priced, minus 15% that can be stored. We have to have 35% of the soybeans in Brazil cannot be stored on farm and have not been sold. So over a third of the beans. What's going to happen to those beans? Option number one, custom storage. But option number two, sell it over the scales. And here's where a little bit of background information helps. A lot of the loans come due at the end of April. So it's even a known thing, similar to maybe some notes that are called at the end of the year or whatever. But a lot of the notes need to be paid by the end of April. So of this 35% of the crop, a lot of that, probably needs to be sold by the end of April for cash flow reasons to make payments. That's what a lot of the soybeans need to be priced at. The point that I'm trying to make is really kind of the conclusion down here at the bottom. We really haven't started experiencing the pressure of harvest sales out of Brazil yet. Yes, have some beans been sold over the scales? For sure. Has there been selling pressure? Yes. But the prices are horrible, especially in Brazilian currency. Most of them don't have to sell because of the calendar yet. They have to sell by the end of April. And most of what's been harvested so far is just filling contracts. So we haven't really seen selling pressure from the Brazilian farmer. And this is important background information for the next slide that I'm going to show you, which is the exchange rate. My phone was blowing up this week because of this move right here. That move, and just for the sake of reference, what happened was we saw with all of the situation going on in the Middle East and with the Gulf, we saw the dollar tick up in value, and we saw this little bump in the Brazilian exchange rate. So when that goes up, when the dollar is worth more, they export and they get more Brazilian currency. So effectively what we saw was a rise in prices. Chicago's also been friendly this week, right? But we saw some of the highest prices in Brazilian currency this week that we had seen in, I think you would have to go back to November, the November highs. So that move right there in exchange rate, it piqued a lot of farmers' interest, and they're like, man, I've got to take advantage of this. Should I be selling this? Is this an opportunity to sell? And just for perspective, and I'm not saying exchange rate goes back up here, right? But just look at this bump, right? That's not a very significant bump in the market to get a really big reaction. Why is there such a big reaction about this bump? Well, because anywhere from 30 to 40% of the beans in Brazil need to be sold in the next, 7 weeks? Maybe 6 weeks if the check needs to clear in time, for the bank to process it. If you don't get paid immediately, by the time you fill orders and contracts, sometimes there's a week or two, a lag time before the check clears so you can pay your loans. I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is we will very likely face significant amount of selling pressure coming out of Brazil over the next 6 to 8 weeks, just because it can't be stored. They need the cash and it hasn't been forward priced. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be something soybean related to make that price, to make those sales happen. In Brazilian currency, the exchange rate impacts, depending on basis, right? But with fairly stable basis, the exchange rate fluctuation tends to impact their price in Brazilian currency more than fluctuations to the Chicago Board of Trade price. So something that's not even related to the Board of Trade price, not even related to the price of soybeans, if all of a sudden this exchange rate would go up to this zone here, and farmers are saying, oh gosh, I've got to sell everything. I've never seen these prices in 4 or 5 months, and if I don't do this, I can't pay. If that exchange rate climbs even just a little bit, and maybe even if it doesn't, we're very likely going to experience a lot of selling pressure out of Brazilian farmers. And again, South America is just part of the picture, but knowing this, being aware of this, makes a huge difference when you're making your plans on selling. Should I sell now? Should I sell later? Should I be aggressive? Well, if you know that over the next 4 to 6 weeks, very likely 60, 70, 80 million metric tons of Brazilian soybeans about have to be priced, that's a lot of selling pressure. I mean, that is a lot of selling pressure on the market. So if, it makes a difference to be plugged into South America. There's a solid way that we make decisions here at Santos Springs on making recommendations. If you're looking for help with your grain marketing, shoot me an email, and On the one hand, it's frustrating to have all of the volatility in markets because there's so many unknowns. On the other hand, after last year with just this sideways trade, it's nice to have at least some opportunities opening up, because when prices are just sideways and there's no way you can turn a profit, there's not even any levers you can pull. So buckle up. It looks like we're in for a doozy of a year. We've got USDA reports coming out next week. A lot to go over. Have a great rest of your day, great rest of your weekend.